The fog in London is not merely a weather condition. It is a heavy, living shroud that swallows the chimes of Big Ben and turns the distant gaslights into pale, flickering ghosts. On this particular morning in Baker Street, the air inside our rooms felt as thick as the mist outside, weighed down by the scent of old parchment and the sharp, rhythmic bubbling of Sherlock Holmes's chemical retort. It was a sound of profound mechanical consistency, a small, boiling heartbeat that served as the only metronome for a city lost in gray. But beneath this peaceful surface, a scandal was brewing that threatened the very foundation of British authority. Not a crime of blood or gold, but a crime of logic so perfect it defied the laws of the physical world. Sherlock Holmes stood over the spirit lamp, his silhouette a thin, motionless shadow against the towering bookshelves. He did not move, yet the intensity of his focus was a palpable force, vibrating through the quiet room. I sat upon the sofa, watching the way the vapor from the retort rose in a slow, hypnotic spiral toward the soot-stained ceiling. Every few seconds, a soft, muffled pop would break the silence, followed by the faint hiss of cooling glass. It was a lullaby of industry, a steady song that spoke of a world where every effect has a cause and every mystery has a key. Yet, as I looked at the morning paper in my lap, I saw a string of words that made no sense, a tribute to the Queen that read like a revolutionary manifesto, despite every letter being in its proper place. Outside, the great capital had been reduced to a collection of muffled echoes and distant, heavy thuds. The clatter of a hansom cab somewhere on the cobbles felt miles away, filtered through layers of damp velvet. It was a time for stillness, the kind of hour where the mind seeks refuge in the familiar patterns of a crackling fire and the warmth of a tea service. I watched the way the orange light from the hearth danced upon the leather spines of Holmes's encyclopedia, creating a sanctuary of order amidst the chaos of the London winter. We were waiting in the deep silence, suspended between the heartbeat and the breath, for the arrival of a man whose life's work had been turned upside down by a ghost in the printing press. The street door far below groaned upon its hinges, a heavy metallic groan that shivered through the floorboards beneath my feet. It was the sound of a world out of balance as the heavy footsteps began their slow, deliberate ascent up the 17 steps to our door. Holmes finally turned away from his glass tubes. His eyes, usually as sharp as a hawk's, were softened by the dim twilight of the room. Yet they held a spark of anticipatory fire. The rhythm of the retort continued, steady and unshakable, a reminder that while the fog might hide the truth, it could never truly erase it. I adjusted my cushion, feeling the soft texture of the fabric against my neck, and prepared myself for the story that was about to unfold, a tale of a boy who spoke in shadows and a machine that began to think for itself. The silence of our room was deep, a vast ocean of quietude that seemed to hold the very essence of Victorian London within its grasp. I could hear the faint, distant whistle of a locomotive at Victoria Station, a lonely sound that drifted over the rooftops and through the layers of soot and steam. It was a reminder of the vast, interlocking machinery of the empire, a world built on the precision of clockwork and the absolute certainty of the printed word. Beside me, the embers in the fireplace shifted with a soft, musical crunch, releasing a brief plume of golden sparks that vanished into the chimney's throat. Everything in this space was designed for comfort, for the steady contemplation of the impossible. Holmes moved with a feline grace, his long fingers trailing across the edge of the mahogany table as he approached the window. He peered out into the opacity of the street, his reflection ghostly against the dark glass. To him, the fog was not a barrier, but a canvas upon which the city wrote its most complex riddles. He spoke no word, for the silence between us was an old friend, one that required no interruption. The ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece grew louder in my ears, each second a rhythmic pulse that anchored me to the present moment. It was a grounding sensation, a feeling of being perfectly centered while the rest of the world dissolved into the formless gray of the morning. I thought of the newspaper again, that strange inverted document that lay across my knees. The ink was still fresh enough to carry that faint, metallic scent that lingers in the halls of Fleet Street. It was a scent of industry and influence, of truths being forged in the heat of the press and distributed to a million breakfast tables. But this morning, the truth had been warped. The logic of the editorial had been turned upon itself, not through a change in facts, but through a subtle, brilliant manipulation of the very soul of the language. It was a challenge that only a mind like Holmes's could truly appreciate, a puzzle of pure thought, stripped of the vulgarity of common crime. The footsteps on the stairs reached the landing, heavy and hesitant, as if the person behind them was carrying the weight of a collapsing world. I felt a slight draft beneath the door, a cool thread of air that carried the smell of rain and wet wool. It was the herald of the outside world, the first ripple in the stagnant pool of our morning. I watched as Holmes straightened his collar, his face becoming a mask of detached intellectual curiosity. The bubbling of the retort seemed to slow, or perhaps it was only my heart settling into a deeper, more expectant rhythm. We were no longer alone in our sanctuary. The mystery had arrived, and it brought with it the cold, unyielding breath of the London streets. As the handle of the door began to turn, a slow and deliberate movement that seemed to take an eternity, I leaned back further into the shadows of the sofa. The world of sleep and the world of waking were blurring at the edges, the rhythmic sounds of the room weaving themselves into a tapestry of anticipation. I knew that whatever walked through that door would change the color of the day, turning our peaceful isolation into a journey through the hidden arteries of the city. But for now, in this final moment of stillness, there was only the fog, the fire, and the steady, unwavering heartbeat of 221B Baker Street, Tactile. The door opened, and the story began to breathe. The light from the hallway spilled in, a dim and amber glow that cut through the shadows of the room. It revealed the figure of a man who looked as though he had been carved from the very soot of the city, tall, imposing, and deeply troubled. He stood there for a moment, framed by the doorway, a silhouette of Victorian anxiety. In his hand, he clutched a rolled-up copy of the Times, his knuckles white with the intensity of his grip. This was Sir Jasper Phipps, a man whose name was synonymous with the power of the press, and yet he stood before us now like a supplicant, seeking a light that he could not find within his own vast empire of ink. The transition from our quiet morning to the narrative of his distress was seamless, a soft shifting of gears in the grand machinery of our lives. Holmes inclined his head, a gesture of silent invitation that was as smooth as the music of his violin. The game was afoot, but it was a game played in the whispers of the mind and the shadows of the basement. I watched as Sir Jasper stepped forward, his boots sinking into the thick carpet with a sound that was barely a sound at all. The atmosphere of the room shifted, absorbing his tension and transforming it into the fuel for our investigation. The fog outside seemed to press even closer, sealing us in, creating a world where only the three of us existed. It was a moment of perfect narrative immersion, where the past and the present converged in the flickering light of the spirit lamp. And so, the mystery of the Inverted Intern began not with a scream, but with the soft rustling sound of a newspaper being laid upon a table, its secrets waiting to be unraveled by the man who saw what all others merely observed. Sir Jasper Phipps did not simply enter the room. He seemed to materialize out of the amber glow of the hallway, bringing with him the cold, damp scent of the London morning. His breathing was heavy, a series of ragged, rhythmic exhales that spoke of a man who had climbed our 17 steps, not just with physical effort, but with the crushing weight of a collapsing reputation. I watched as he stood by the door for a moment, his chest heaving beneath a heavy overcoat of charcoal wool. The fabric was expensive, the kind of material that usually spoke of ironclad confidence, yet now it merely rustled with every trembling movement of his frame. It was a soft, dry sound, like the shifting of dead leaves in a winter garden, echoing in the quiet spaces of our sanctuary. Holmes did not rise, but his silence was a profound invitation to speak. He watched with half-closed eyes as Sir Jasper reached up with a gloved hand to wipe the condensation from his brow. The man's face was flushed, a deep mahogany red that contrasted sharply with the silver of his sideburns. He looked like a pillar of the establishment that had suddenly found its foundation turned to sand. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to grate against the quietude of the room. He spoke of his paper, the Times, not as a commercial venture, but as a sacred trust, a granite monument of truth in a world of fleeting whispers. To Sir Jasper, a single error in its columns was more than a mistake. It was a crack in the very dome of St. Paul's Cathedral. He moved toward the armchair I had vacated, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he feared that any sudden gesture might shatter the fragile reality he was still clinging to. The rustle of his coat continued, a constant, textured background to his words, a sound that felt like the turning of 1,000 heavy pages in a silent library. He began to describe the sanctity of the editorial room, the quiet, the focus, the absolute hierarchy of the newspaper, known as the Thunderer. He spoke of the men who worked there as if they were monks tending to a holy flame, each one vetted by time, each one a master of the Queen's English. The printing house, he claimed, was a fortress of logic, a place where the chaotic events of the world were refined into the cold, hard gold of authoritative prose. But as he leaned forward, the firelight catching the moisture in his wide, anxious eyes, the tone of his voice shifted. It became softer, more intimate, as if he were confessing a sin that haunted his deepest sleep. He described the editorial that had been prepared for the morning edition a staunch, unwavering defense of the government's naval expenditures. It had been written with precision, vetted by the highest authorities in the land, and locked into the metal forms of the press with the absolute certainty of a mathematical law. It was meant to be a clarion call to the nation, a masterpiece of patriotic fervor that would leave no room for doubt or dissent. It was the very embodiment of order, yet, when the first copies were pulled from the steam-driven presses in the damp hours before dawn, the miracle of inversion had occurred. Sir Jasper pulled the crumpled sheet from his pocket with a hand that shook visibly. He laid it upon the mahogany table, smoothing it out with his palm in a slow, rhythmic motion that felt almost like a ritual of mourning. I leaned in, the scent of fresh ink and damp paper rising to meet me in the dim light. It was a scent that usually promised clarity, but today it carried only the perfume of a paradox. The words were all there, every comma and every period exactly where they ought to be. But the soul of the message had been brilliantly, surgically reversed. The patriotic call had become a whisper of doubt, the logic turned upside down. Holmes leaned forward, his long, thin shadow falling across the newsprint like the needle of a grand, ancient compass. He did not speak, but I could see the spark of intellectual hunger igniting in his eyes, a steady flame of curiosity. He took a magnifying glass from the mantelpiece, a heavy, brass-rimmed lens that caught the light of the fire and began to hover over the columns of text. The room fell into a profound silence, broken only by the soft, rhythmic ticking of the clock and the distant, muffled roar of the London traffic. It was a silence of deep study, a moment where the frantic energy of Sir Jasper's distress was absorbed into the cool, analytical vacuum of Holmes's mind. Through the glass, the letters appeared as gargantuan monuments of ink, each one a tiny sculpture of leaden pressure. Holmes moved the lens slowly, tracing the lines of the editorial as if he were following a trail through a dense, unfamiliar forest of symbols. He was looking for the seams, the microscopic joins where the logic had been severed and reattached. He scrutinized the spacing, the kerning, the very grain of the paper itself as it absorbed the black liquid of the press. His breathing became shallow and regular, matching the steady pulse of the room. It was a study in stillness, a demonstration of how a chaotic problem could be tamed through the simple act of looking at the physical evidence. Sir Jasper watched him with the desperation of a drowning man, his own breath settling into a more regular pattern as he yielded to the authority of Holmes's silence. The fire crackled softly, a sudden burst of warmth that seemed to underscore the gravity of our task. There was no violence here, no bloodstains on the carpet, yet the tension was as thick as any mystery I had ever chronicled. It was a crime against the mind, a ghost in the machine that had used the very tools of order to create a masterpiece of subversion. The editorial did not read like a prank. It read like the work of a scholar who had found the one flaw in a perfect argument and pulled upon the thread until the whole garment unraveled into something new. After what seemed like an eternity of quiet observation, Holmes straightened his back. He did not offer a solution, but his expression had changed from curiosity to a grim, satisfied determination. He laid the magnifying glass aside with a soft click that echoed in the stillness. He looked at Sir Jasper, and for the first time that morning, a thin, wintry smile played across his lip. The problem was not in the minds of the editors, nor was it in the ink of the printers. It was something far more subtle, something that existed in the transition between the thought and the page. It was a phantom that lived in the heart of the great machine itself, a secret hidden in the plumbing of the press. The decision was made without the need for lengthy debate. The sanctuary of Baker Street had served its purpose as a place of initial contemplation, but the answer lay elsewhere, in the world of steam and iron. We would have to descend into the very belly of the beast, into the soot-stained labyrinth of Printing House Square. We would have to walk among the hissing pipes and the thundering presses to find the hand that had dared to tilt the scales of logic. Holmes reached for his ulster, the heavy fabric falling over his shoulders with a familiar, reassuring weight that signaled the end of our stillness and the beginning of our quest. I looked at the way his fingers moved with such precision as he buttoned his coat, a rhythm of readiness. He looked at me, his eyes bright with the thrill of the chase, though his voice remained as calm and steady as the ticking of the clock on the mantel. There was a sense of inevitability now, a feeling that the gears of justice were beginning to turn in harmony with the gears of the city. We were moving from the realm of thought into the realm of action, yet the transition felt as natural as the shifting of the tides. The weight of Sir Jasper's anxiety seemed to lighten slightly, shared now with a mind that found joy in the unraveling of such intricate knots. As we prepared to leave, I looked once more at the newspaper lying on the table. In the fading light of the fire, the black ink seemed to shimmer, as if the words were still shifting, still trying to find their true meaning in the shadows. The fog outside was waiting for us, a vast gray ocean that we were about to navigate in search of a single hidden truth. Sir Jasper stood up, his posture slightly more erect, his trust now placed in the man who saw the world as a series of interlocking gears. We stepped toward the door, leaving the warmth of the hearth behind, ready to enter the cold, rhythmic heart of the city's most powerful engine. The hallway was cool, a sharp contrast to the heated air of the drawing room. Our footsteps on the stairs were a rhythmic descent, a steady beat that echoed against the wallpapered walls. I felt the transition deeply, the movement from the safe, enclosed space of our home into the vast, unpredictable theater of London. The fog greeted us at the street level, a damp embrace that smelled of coal smoke and river water. It was a world of shadows and muffled sounds, a place where the boundaries between reality and imagination felt thin. But we walked with purpose, led by the tall, lean figure of Holmes, who carved a path through the mist, as if he were walking through the corridors of his own mind. Sir Jasper followed, his heavy breathing now synchronized with the pace of our walk. The city around us was a symphony of industrial life, a low thrum of activity that felt like a living creature. We were heading toward the river, toward the place where the news of the world was forged in heat and pressure. Every street lamp we passed was a beacon in the gloom, a momentary anchor in the shifting gray. The mystery of the inverted intern was no longer a story told in a warm room. It was a physical presence, a puzzle waiting for us in the dark corners of the printing house. The journey to the center of the mystery had begun, and the city itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. We turned the corner into a narrower alley, where the sound of the great presses began to grow. A distant, rhythmic thundering that felt like the pulse of the empire. It was a sound that was both intimidating and deeply comforting in its regularity. Holmes paused for a moment, listening to the vibration of the ground beneath his feet. He was already deciphering the language of the machinery, looking for the discord in the grand mechanical chorus. The air was growing heavier with the scent of oil and steam, a sign that we were nearing the heart of the square. Our adventure was no longer a matter of words. It was a matter of iron and air, of finding the ghosts that lived within the pipes. Printing House Square sits as a silent sentinel of history, a place where the weight of the past is measured not in years, but in the layers of soot and the deep, persistent scent of ancient stone. As we stepped into the courtyard, the transition from the chaotic, shifting fog of the streets to this fortress of information was immediate and profound. The air here was different. It carried a cool, metallic sharpness, a blend of damp masonry, and the rich, oily perfume of fresh printer's ink. It was a scent that had permeated these walls for generations, sinking into the very pores of the brickwork, until the building itself seemed to breathe the language of the press. I felt a sense of profound intellectual comfort, a feeling of being standing at the precise, unmoving center of the world's recorded memory. The history of this ground was a long, slow evolution of thought into form, a steady progression of human intent carved into the reality of the city. Long before the steam-driven giants of the Victorian era arrived, this square had been a place of quiet industry. A sanctuary where the slow scratching of quills had eventually given way to the rhythmic clatter of wooden type. There is a dignity in such a place, a stability that the modern world often lacks. Every cobblestone beneath our feet seemed to hum with the resonance of a million headlines, a million stories that had once been the urgent talk of the town and were now merely the foundation upon which we walked. The architecture was solid, unyielding, and possessed of a gravity that commanded a lower tone of voice and a slower, more deliberate pace from everyone who entered. We moved toward the main entrance, where the great doors of dark oak stood as the threshold between the silence of the square and the rhythmic, hidden heartbeat of the nation. Upon entering, the sound of the city was replaced by a low, constant vibration, a deep, subterranean thrum that one felt in the soles of their boots before hearing it with their ears. This was the voice of the Thunderer, the nickname given to the grand, intricate machinery of the time. It was a sound of immense power held in perfect, rhythmic check, a mechanical symphony that never ceased, turning the raw energy of steam into the refined, polished product of public opinion. The vibration was soothing in its regularity, a pulse that seemed to align with the very breath of the building. The press room itself was a vast cathedral of iron and steam, a monument to the industrial soul of England. Great pillars of cast iron rose toward a ceiling, lost in the deep shadows of the upper galleries, and between them sat the presses, monstrous, beautiful constructs of gleaming brass and blackened steel. They were the iron lungs of the empire, drawing in vast, endless rolls of blank paper and exhaling the finished history of the day. I watched the way the great cylinders turned, a slow and majestic rotation that seemed to mimic the turning of the earth itself upon its axis. There was a mesmerizing hypnotic quality to the movement, a repetitive circular grace that invited the mind to let go of its anxieties and simply observe the perfection of the cycle. Holmes walked among these giants with a look of quiet reverence, his long, slender fingers occasionally reaching out to touch a cold railing or a vibrating copper pipe. He was observing the architecture of the print, the way the ink was fed from the fountains, through the complex distribution rollers, and finally onto the waiting type. The machinery was an extension of the human mind, a grand externalization of logic and order. Each gear was precisely cut, each lever balanced to the fraction of an ounce, moving in a dance of absolute certainty. In this space, everything was quantifiable. Everything followed the immutable laws of physics. It was the ultimate safe haven for a man who lived by the rule of cause and effect, a temple of pure, mechanical reason. We reached the central press, the one responsible for the morning's controversial editorial, which now stood like a silent titan in the dim light. It stood idle now, a silent mountain of cooling metal, yet it still seemed to radiate a phantom energy. Sir Jasper led us to the compositor's table nearby, where the physical plates, the actual forms of lead type, lay under the steady amber flicker of a gas jet. These were the very objects that had kissed the paper, the physical source of the morning's confusion and distress. Holmes bent over them, his eyes narrow and keen in the half-light. With a steady, practiced hand, he ran his fingertips over the raised surfaces of the letters, feeling the texture of the language. Every character was sharp. Every line of type was locked firmly into place with steel wedges that showed no sign of tampering. The reveal was a silent one, yet it carried the weight of a physical blow to the senses. As Holmes examined the plates, it became undeniably clear. The metal was correct. The lead type, cast in the fires of the foundry, bore the original patriotic message of the editors. The P in patriotism was a P. The S in sovereignty was an S. In the world of physical matter, the logic held firm and unyielding. There was no tampering here, no hidden switches or replaced characters, no evidence of human error or malice. It was a paradox. In metal the source was true, the machinery was perfect, and yet the result was a brilliant total inversion. It was as if the laws of reflection had been broken, as if the ink had decided to rewrite itself in the brief, microscopic moment of contact. This realization brought with it a strange, quiet stillness that settled over us like the dust in the corners of the room. If the metal was true, then the mystery lived in the spaces between the metal, in the transitions that we could not see. We moved away from the thrumming heat of the press room, retreating into the long, quiet corridors that housed the vast archives of the newspaper. These hallways were lined from floor to ceiling with heavy, leather-bound volumes, the collective, ink-stained memory of the entire century. The air here was still and smelled of dust, leather, and slowly aging paper. It was a lull in the narrative, a moment to breathe in the vastness of the information that surrounded us. Walking through these archives was like walking through a forest of frozen thoughts, a place where the noise of the present was muffled by the sheer, overwhelming volume of the past. The silence here was a different kind of quiet, one that felt heavy with the weight of millions of words. We walked slowly, our footsteps swallowed by the thick runner that lined the floor. Holmes moved with his head tilted, as if listening to the whispers of the old volume. There was a sense of peace in this corridor, a feeling that no matter how chaotic the current moment seemed, it would eventually be bound in leather and placed upon a shelf, becoming part of the long, steady stream of history. It was a comforting thought, a reminder of the transience of crisis and the endurance of the record. The walls seemed to pulse with the rhythmic heartbeat of the presses below, but here, the pulse was softened, a gentle reminder of the world's constant motion. The transition was subtle, a shift from the heavy grounded world of iron, and led to the ethereal, invisible world of air and movement. As we walked toward the editorial offices, Holmes began to look upward, his gaze tracing the ceiling, where a complex, interlacing network of polished brass tubes ran like silver veins through the building. These were the pneumatic tubes, the high-speed arteries of the office, designed to carry canisters of copy and proof from the editors' desks down to the printers' hands in a matter of seconds. They curved and twisted around the architectural details of the building, disappearing through walls and floors with a silent, streamlined efficiency that seemed almost magical in its grace. I watched the way the dim light glinted off the smooth curves of the brass, creating a series of bright, rhythmic highlights that seemed to pulse with the hidden movement of the air within. The tubes were a marvel of Victorian engineering, a system that promised to bridge the gap between thought and execution at the speed of a whistle. They were beautiful in their simplicity, yet they represented the very transition we were investigating, the journey of the word from the mind of the writer to the machine of the printer. They were the veins of the thunderer, carrying the lifeblood of information through the dark, silent spaces of the building. As we stood there, beneath that maze of silver veins, the sound of the great presses downstairs seemed to fade into a distant, rhythmic hum, leaving us in a state of suspended animation. We were staring up at the elegant, air-filled pathways that held the secret to the ghost in the machine. The tubes didn't just carry paper. They carried the intent of the city, the whispered secrets of the government, and the loud proclamations of the press. Somewhere within that brass labyrinth, the logic had been diverted. Holmes's eyes followed the line of a single tube as it vanished into a dark corner of the ceiling, his mind already calculating the pressures and the distances. The air around us seemed to hold its breath, the quiet of the corridor, the smell of the old books, and the sight of the gleaming brass created a moment of perfect, focused stillness. We were no longer just in a building. We were inside a giant, living organism, and we were looking at its nervous system. The complexity of it was daunting, yet under Holmes's gaze, it began to resolve into a series of understandable patterns. Every bend in the pipe, every junction in the brass, was a potential chapter in the story we were uncovering. I felt a deep sense of calm as we lingered there. The mystery was no longer a frantic puzzle of reversed meanings. It was a physical map, a series of silver lines that we could follow to their source. The transition from the heavy iron of the presses to the light, airy grace of the tubes felt like a movement toward the truth. We were leaving the world of the obvious and entering the world of the subtle. Holmes turned to Sir Jasper, his voice a low, steady murmur that did not disturb the peace of the archives. He was ready to move forward, to trace the air itself until he found the point where the world had been turned upside down. As we prepared to follow the line of the tubes toward the editorial rooms, I looked back one last time at the long, dark corridor of the archives. The leather volumes stood in their silent rank, a testament to the endurance of the word. They were safe here, protected by the walls and the silence. But out there, in the brass veins of the building, the word was in motion, vulnerable and shifting. We stepped forward, our eyes fixed on the silver trails above, ready to enter the next phase of our journey through the architecture of the print. The secret was waiting for us, hidden in the rush of air and the cold embrace of the brass. The brass network above us was not merely a decorative element of the building's architecture. It was a living, breathing labyrinth of pressurized intent, a grand cardiovascular system for the city's most vital information. As we followed Sir Jasper deeper into the heart of the editorial wing, The sound of the great presses downstairs began to recede into a dull, comforting hum, replaced by a much more intimate and rhythmic chorus. It started as a distant, airy sigh, a long, drawn-out hiss that seemed to travel through the very marrow of the walls, vibrating softly against the soles of our boots. Then, moments later, came the thump. It was a dull, heavy vibration, the sound of a leather-bound cylinder arriving at its destination with the finality of a steady heartbeat. Hiss and thump, hiss and thump. The regularity of it was deeply hypnotic, a mechanical breathing cycle that dictated the slow, unwavering pace of the entire newspaper's lifeblood. I watched as a clerk at a nearby station prepared a canister for its long journey. The cylinder itself was a marvel of utilitarian Victorian design, a hollow skeleton of zinc wrapped in thick, oiled leather seals at either end. These seals were the key to the entire mystery of movement. They were designed to fit the interior of the polished brass pipes, with a tolerance so precise that not a single breath of air could escape around them. When the clerk slid the canister into the dark open mouth of the receiving station and pulled the heavy brass lever, the world seemed to hold its breath for a fleeting microsecond. Then, with a sudden, sharp intake of atmospheric pressure, the canister was sucked into the void, vanishing into the silver arteries of the building. The physics of the system were as beautiful as they were invisible, a hidden world of forces operating in the silence of the masonry. Somewhere deep in the sub-basement, colossal steam-driven air pumps worked day and night to create a permanent vacuum in one set of tubes and a constant state of overpressure in the other. It was a world of invisible hands, of pushes and pulls that existed in the dark, hollow spaces behind the wainscoting. Inside those polished brass veins, the canisters traveled at a terrifying speed, propelled by nothing but the sheer weight of the air itself. Holmes stood beneath a junction where 4 pipes converged, his head tilted back in the dim light, his eyes following the unseen transit of information. He seemed to be visualizing the vacuum, sensing the way the air thinned and thickened in a rhythmic, eternal dance of physics. We began to follow the primary artery, the thickest and most resonant of the brass pipes, as it descended slowly toward the bowels of the building. The air in the stairwell grew cooler with every step, smelling of damp earth, old stone, and the faint, sweet scent of the lubricating oil used to keep the leather seals supple and airtight. As we moved, the sounds followed us like a persistent shadow. Shh, thump, shh, thump. Each transit took exactly the same amount of time, measured in the silent intervals of our breath. Each hiss was of the same duration, a steady exhalation of the machine. Each thump carried the same resonant frequency, a grounding note in the symphony of the office. It was a masterclass in Victorian precision, a system where human error had been replaced by the immutable, comforting laws of aerodynamics. I felt my own breathing begin to synchronize with the tubes, my footsteps falling in perfect time with the arrival of the canisters. The complexity of the labyrinth increased as we reached the lower levels, where the shadows grew longer and the air grew more still. Here, the tubes branched out like the ancient roots of a great oak, disappearing into dark alcoves and through heavy soot-stained masonry arches. Holmes moved with a slow, predatory grace, his magnifying glass tucked away for now as he relied entirely on his ears. He was listening for the hitch, that microscopic, almost imperceptible hesitation in the sound that would signal a flaw in the perfection of the cycle. We passed through a section of the basement where the walls were made of massive blocks of granite, built to withstand the relentless vibration of the city above. The tubes here were braced with heavy iron brackets, bolted deep into the unyielding stone, their surfaces shimmering faintly in the twilight. It was here, in the dim and flickering light of a single, lonely gas jet, that the reveal began to manifest in the quiet. Holmes stopped abruptly, at a point where the main tube vanished into a particularly thick and foreboding section of the basement wall-y blind spot, where the architecture of the building seemed to swallow the machinery whole. To the casual observer, the pipe simply entered the stone and emerged on the other side, 30 feet away, in the compositor's room. But Holmes remained stationary, his gloved hand resting lightly on the cold, vibrating brass. He was not looking at the pipe. He was feeling the vibration within it, sensing the story that the metal was trying to tell. In this forgotten corner of the foundation, the rhythm of the building changed. We stood in the absolute, heavy silence of the subterranean dark, waiting for the next transit to occur. Shh! The sound of the approaching canister grew louder, vibrating through the brass and into the very air we breathed. But as it entered the blind spot in the wall, the sound did not simply pass through in a straight line. There was a momentary subtle softening of the hiss, a fraction of a second where the tone shifted from a sharp whistle to a hollow, resonant echo, followed by a double thump that was almost too faint for the human ear to catch. It was a glitch in the symphony, a tiny, rhythmic hiccup that occurred exactly halfway between the editor's desk and the printer's hand. The vacuum was being whispered to. We stood there for a long time, bathed in the low amber glow of the flickering gaslight, surrendered to the lull of the machinery. Shh! Thump! Shh! The sound became a background radiation, a white noise that stripped away the complexities of the case and left only the physical reality of the air and the stone. The repetition was a sedative, pulling the mind down into the depths of the building's mechanical soul, away from the worries of the waking world. I found myself staring at the soot-patterned bricks, my thoughts drifting on the currents of the vacuum, imagining the canisters, flying through the dark like silver shuttles in a vast industrial loom, weaving the fabric of the day's news. Holmes did not speak, for words would have shattered the delicate web of sound he was weaving. He did not need to. The logic of the tubes was beginning to reveal its secrets to him through the language of vibration and resistance. He moved his ear closer to the masonry, his face pressed against the cold, damp stone of the wall in a gesture of profound intimacy with the building. He looked like a man trying to hear the heartbeat of a mountain, or perhaps a sailor listening to the shifting of the tides against a hull. To anyone else, this was merely a solid barrier of brick and mortar, a structural necessity of a massive Victorian edifice. But to Holmes, it was a veil, a thin curtain of matter hiding a masterpiece of redirected intent. The bridge to our next discovery was found in his absolute stillness, a quietude that seemed to command the very air to stop moving. He signaled for us to remain perfectly quiet, his finger pressed to his lips in the gloom. The distant roar of the presses felt like a fading memory from another life. The only thing that existed in our universe was the wall and the air. He began to tap the bricks with the bone handle of his pocket knife, a slow, rhythmic tapping that sought the hollow truth hidden behind the solid, soot-stained facade. Each strike produced a dull, flat sound that spoke of density and weight, until suddenly, at the very edge of the blind spot, the note changed. It was a higher, clearer ring, a tiny chime of vacancy in a world of solid weight. It was the sound of an empty space, a hidden chamber carved into the heart of the newspaper's foundation. He paused at that seemingly unremarkable stretch of brickwork, his head bowed as if in prayer or deep meditation. The air-driven canisters continued their relentless, rhythmic journey. Thump! But the sound was no longer just a cycle of work and industry. It was a map, a series of auditory clues leading us to the center of the labyrinth. Holmes remained there, listening intently to the secret life of the wall, his mind already reaching through the stone to grasp the hand that lived in the dark. We waited in the shadows, the rhythmic repetition of the pneumatic labyrinth weaving its final hypnotic spell around us. Before the truth was finally dragged from the silence into the light, the intensity of the pneumatic labyrinth gradually faded as we retreated from the damp stone of the foundation, moving upward toward the surface of the city. We found ourselves in a small wood-paneled tavern, tucked away in a narrow court, just off Fleet Street, a sanctuary of stillness in the heart of the bustling capital. The transition was a gentle one, a softening of the senses that felt like stepping out of a storm and into a warm, familiar embrace. Here, the sharp, persistent hiss of the tubes and the thundering of the distant presses were replaced by a profound, human silence, broken only by the muffled, distant sounds of London passing by outside the frosted windows. The air was thick with the comforting scent of roasted malt, beeswax, and the faint, lingering aroma of wood smoke from a hearth that had seen a century of winters. It was a place of deep shadows and amber light, a sanctuary where the frantic pace of the morning was absorbed into the dark, polished grain of the heavy oak tables. I watched the steam rise from our simple luncheon in slow, swirling patterns, a visual echo of the fog that continued to ghost against the leaded glass. The tavern was nearly empty, save for an old clerk dozing in a corner booth, his chin resting upon his chest in a state of perfect, rhythmic peace. The clatter of a passing hansom cab reached us as a low, rolling vibration, a sound that seemed to come from another world entirely, filtered through layers of brick and time. It was a moment of absolute, focused stillness, a midpoint echo in our investigation where the mind begins to settle, drifting away from the mechanical complexities of the machine and toward the quiet, steady contemplation of the soul. Holmes sat opposite me, his long, thin fingers wrapped around a glass of water, his gaze fixed on the way the light refracted through the liquid in a dance of miniature rainbows. He was uncharacteristically quiet, his mind clearly still navigating the brass arteries we had just left behind, tracing the invisible paths of the vacuum. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, melodic murmur that seemed to blend perfectly with the heavy shadows of the room. He began to discuss the psychology of the reversal, speaking not of motives or political power, but of the inherent, undeniable beauty of a perfectly balanced thought. He suggested that the inversion of the editorial was not an act of rebellion, nor a calculated move to damage the reputation of the establishment. To Holmes, it felt like something far more intimate, a manifestation of a mind that found the world's lack of logic to be a source of physical, unbearable pain. The discussion drifted like the smoke from a pipe, circling the idea that the culprit was not seeking influence, but symmetry in a world of chaos. We spoke of how most men view the world as a series of disjointed, overlapping events, but for a certain kind of intellect, a sentence is a bridge that must be perfectly weighted at both ends. If the logic of a statement is flawed, it creates a discord in the universe that must be resolved, a tension that demands a release. I felt a sense of drowsy fascination as he spoke, the warmth of the tavern and the steady, rhythmic flow of his words pulling me down into a state of comfortable, lethargic observation. The mystery was transforming from a puzzle of ink and air into a study of human compulsion, a quiet obsession with a perfect logic that lived in the silent, forgotten spaces of the building. The reveal came softly, like the falling of a single leaf in a windless forest. This was not a political plot born in the smoky, crowded rooms of a revolutionary club. It was a solitary endeavor, a masterpiece of quiet dissent created by someone who loved the language more than the message it carried. The inversion was too clean, too surgically precise to be the work of a common vandal or a disgruntled employee. It was the work of someone who saw the editorial as a flawed equation and felt a desperate, almost holy need to balance it, to turn the world right side up through the power of a perfectly placed comma. This realization shifted the energy of our quest. We were no longer hunting a common criminal, but a ghost who lived for the sake of an absolute, unyielding truth, a specter haunting the margins of the news. As the afternoon wore on, the shadows across the tavern floor began to lengthen, stretching in long, elegant lines of charcoal across the scattered sawdust. The golden light of the winter sun, weak and filtered through the thick London soot, created small pools of warmth on the dark, seasoned wood of our table. I found myself watching the dust motes dancing in a single narrow beam of light, their movements slow and purposeless, a microcosm of the city's hidden, rhythmic life. It was a lull in the narrative that felt like a lucid dream, a moment where the boundaries of the case blurred into the general, peaceful atmosphere of the Victorian afternoon. My eyelids grew heavy, the steady, distant hum of the city acting as a lullaby that promised a peace I had not felt since we left the sanctuary of Baker Street. The silence in the tavern grew deeper, more profound as the fire in the hearth settled into a steady orange glow. The dozing clerk in the corner let out a long, contented sigh, his breathing a rhythmic counterpoint to the slow ticking of the grandfather clock behind the bar. Holmes remained motionless, a silhouette of focused, quiet thought against the amber backdrop of the room. We were suspended in this transition, caught between the mechanical noise of the morning and the human stillness of the evening. The world of iron and steam felt like a distant, fading memory, replaced by the tactile, grounding reality of the wood, the glass, and the lengthening shadows. It was a safe, enclosed space where the mystery could breathe, evolving from a frantic chase into a slow, deliberate unfolding of human character. I could feel the weight of the building around us, the history of Fleet Street pressing in with a comforting, protective gravity. There was no urgency here, only the steady passage of time and the slow digestion of fact. Holmes's voice continued to weave its spell, exploring the dark corners of the human mind with the same precision he used to explore the dark corners of the city. He spoke of the solitude of genius, the way an obsession can become a companion in the lonely hours of the night. I watched the way the shadows danced upon the walls, creating shifting patterns that seemed to mimic the complexity of the case we were unraveling. Everything was connected. Everything was part of a grander, more harmonious design that was slowly coming into focus. But as the light began to fade from the windows, turning the gray fog into a deep, bruised purple, the bridge to the next phase of our journey appeared in the gathering gloom. Holmes stood up, his movement as silent and fluid as a shadow across the floor. He did not need to check his watch. He felt the rhythm of the city changing, the night shift preparing to descend into the bowels of Printing House Square. The time for quiet, amber-lit reflection was passing, and the time for patient observation in the dark was approaching. He looked toward the door, his eyes reflecting the last dying embers of the firelight from the hearth. The peace of the tavern had done its work, centering our minds for the final descent. We stepped out of the warmth of the tavern and back into the cold, damp, and welcoming embrace of the alleyways. The transition back to the shadows was a natural one, a movement from the amber light of the day into the velvet blackness of the newspaper's basement. The sounds of the city were growing louder again, but they were different now, nocturnal, secret, and full of hidden, rhythmic purpose. We were returning to the heart of the machine, but we carried with us the quiet, steady insights of the tavern, the understanding that we were looking for a mind that sought order in the dark. The journey continued, led by the rhythmic clicking of our heels on the wet cobbles, as we moved toward the place where the ghost of logic waited for the arrival of the night. The city held its breath, and we followed the rhythm of the fog. The night shift at Printing House Square did not begin with a roar, but with a rhythmic collective inhalation of 1,000 small industrial lives. As we descended once more into the bowels of the building, the world of the tavern and the amber afternoon felt like a distant, fading memory, replaced by the cool, oil-scented reality of the subterranean dark. Here, The men moved with the absolute precision of the very machines they tended, their shadows stretching long and thin against the soot-stained masonry. I watched them from the deep shadows of a heavy ancient masonry arch compositors, ink monkeys, and furnace feeders, each one a vital, unthinking cog in a grand, invisible clockwork. Their movements were repetitive and almost liturgical in their consistency. The way a heavy tray of lead type was lifted, the way a brass lever was pulled, the way a damp rag was wiped across a blackened plate. They did not speak, for the language of the night shift is one of vibration, touch, and silent. Shared understanding. It was a loop of human industry, a steady and unwavering flow of motion that seemed to hold the city's chaos at bay through the sheer, hypnotic power of routine. Holmes stood beside me, his presence as unobtrusive as a shadow cast by the flickering gaslight. He was not looking at the roaring machines, but at the quiet gaps between the men, the spaces where the light failed to reach. He began to whisper, his voice so low and melodic it was nearly lost in the rhythmic thrum of the floorboards beneath our feet. He spoke of the law of the unnoticed, the profound psychological truth that the most effective way to become invisible is to become indispensable in the simplest of ways. In a society built upon rigid, towering hierarchies, the person who performs the smallest, most repetitive tasks often vanishes entirely from the human eye. We see the newspaper, we see the editor, we even see the magnificent presses, but we never truly look at the hands that carry the ink or the feet that navigate the narrowest service passages in the dark. To the world, these laborers are merely part of the architecture of existence, as unremarkable as the soot on the walls, or the pressurized air in the tubes. As we waited in the gloom, surrendered to the hypnotic lull of the machinery, the ghost we had been seeking began to manifest in the quiet. It was not a sudden appearance, but a slow resolution of a shape within the shifting shadows of the corridor. Near the primary junction of the pneumatic tubes, where the brass pipes vanished into the blind spot we had discovered earlier, a figure was standing with absolute stillness. He was so small, so slight of build, that he seemed almost to be a trick of the flickering light and the rising steam. This was Albie Miller. He was an intern, a boy whose age was impossible to guess from a distance, for his face held the ancient, weary patience of a scholar trapped in the body of a street urchin. He existed in the far margins of the building's life, a quiet anomaly who moved with such a lack of friction that the other workmen bypassed him without a single glance or a word of acknowledgement. He was there, yet he was not there, a living ghost inhabiting the white spaces of the great machine. The reveal of Albie's existence brought with it a sense of profound, melancholy calm that settled over my spirit. He was not a figure of malice or greed, but one of absolute terrifying focus. I watched him through the haze of drifting steam, my heart slowing its beat to match the steady rhythm of his stillness. He held a small wooden crate in his thin arms, resting it against his hip with a grace that was entirely out of place in this heavy, industrial underworld. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't looking over his shoulder for observers. He moved with the quiet confidence of a master craftsman entering his own private sanctuary. To Albie, the thundering presses and the frantic, ego-driven pace of the editorial rooms above were merely background noise to a much more important internal symphony of logic and order. He was a creature of the system, yet entirely apart from it. The lull in the night's activity allowed us to observe his movements in exquisite, lingering detail. Albie reached into the deep shadows of a recessed alcove and produced a small, silver-handled tool, a pair of long, delicate tweezers used by watchmakers. His hands were stained with the permanent black of the ink, yet they moved with a precision that was breathtaking to behold. I watched the way his fingers danced across the cold brass surface of a junction box, feeling for the microscopic seams in the metal with the sensitivity of a musician. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation in his craft. Every gesture was a study in economy, silence, and grace. He worked with a lightness of touch that seemed to defy the heavy iron reality of the basement. It was a tactile experience of industry, the soft clink of metal on metal, the rhythmic rasp of a small file, the quiet, focused breathing of a boy who lived entirely within the vast cathedral of his own mind. His eyes were fixed upon the polished brass of the pneumatic tube with a look of intense scholarly devotion. He wasn't sabotaging the machine in any traditional sense. He was tending to it, correcting its errors, treating it as a flawed manuscript that required his expert, silent intervention. I found myself drifting into a state of empathetic observation, my earlier anxieties about the scandal at the paper replaced by a deep, quiet curiosity about this solitary laborer. What kind of mind finds its only solace in the secret manipulation of air and ink? What kind of heart beats in perfect time with the vacuum? The basement, usually a place of cold stone and hard, unforgiving labor, felt transformed into a sanctuary of quiet, intellectual obsession. It was a world within a world, a loop of perfection being drawn in the dark. Albie turned slightly, his pale face catching the dim, amber glow of a distant lantern hanging from the ceiling. There was no fear in his expression, only a vast, preoccupied intelligence that seemed to look through the walls themselves. He pulled a small, circular mirror from his pocket and angled it toward the light, checking the dark interior of a brass fitting. The reflection danced across the soot-stained ceiling, a rhythmic flash of gold in the dark that appeared and disappeared like a pulse. It was a moment of perfect, crystalline clarity for us. We were seeing the architect of the inversion, the boy who had turned the world upside down, simply because he could not bear to see a sentence that did not balance its own weight. The complexity of the human spirit was laid bare in that small, damp alcove, more intricate and more mysterious than any machine of iron and steam ever built by man. The transition to the next phase of our vigil was as soft as a footfall on damp moss. Albie finished his adjustments to the junction box, his hands moving one last time in a gesture of completion. He began to move away, retreating deeper into the labyrinth of the foundation, away from the flickering gas jets. He didn't use the main, well-lit walkways. He slipped into a narrow secondary passage where the ceiling was low and the pipes were crowded with thick, undisturbed cobwebs. Holmes touched my arm, a silent, grounding signal that required no words between us. We began to follow him, treading softly on the damp, soot-covered floor. Every step was a careful negotiation with the silence of the night, our boots making no more sound than the scurrying of a mouse behind the wainscoting. The air in the narrow passage was still and heavy, with the scent of old oil, cold stone, and the passage of time. The rhythmic thrum of the presses was muffled here, sounding like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant heard from within the womb. We moved in a slow, deliberate loop, mirroring Albie's path through the dark. He was our silent guide through this industrial underworld, a flicker of movement just at the edge of our vision. The law of the unnoticed was now working in our favor as we became ghosts ourselves, following the ghost who had rewritten the news in the name of logic. There was a strange peace in the chase, a feeling of being part of the building's secret life. As we moved, I felt a deep, resonant connection to the rhythm of the building around us. The walls seemed to pulse with a hidden energy, and the silver veins of the pneumatic tubes guided our way through the gloom like ancient markers. We were no longer outsiders. We were part of the night shift now, part of the secret, ink-stained history of the square. Every breath we took was synchronized with the distant hiss of the air pumps. The bridge to the final reveal was laid in the damp dust beneath our feet, and the silent, rhythmic passage of time. We followed Albie toward his hidden junction. Our minds settled into a state of calm, unwavering focus, ready to see the ultimate truth that lived in the dark spaces between the printed lines. The passage narrowed further, the stones becoming slick with the condensation of the steam pipes. Albie stopped for a moment, his head tilted as if listening to a sound we could not hear. We froze in the shadows, our own breathing shallow and regular. The world above the editors, the government, the scandal felt like a dream from which we had finally awakened. In this deep, subterranean reality, there was only the boy, the brass, and the air. He reached out and touched a hidden lever in the wall, a movement so subtle it would have been missed by any eye not trained in the observation of the minute. A small door of blackened iron swung open, without a sound, revealing a chamber that did not appear on any map of the building. We stepped forward, the rhythm of our hearts aligning with the rhythm of the machine, as we prepared to enter the final sanctuary of the Inverted Intern. The narrow secondary passage ended in a wall of tangled iron and copper, a dense thicket of pipes that hissed with the residual warmth of escaping steam. Albie Miller did not hesitate for even a single second. He moved with the fluid, practiced ease of a creature returning to its hidden burrow. He reached toward a heavy cast iron vent, his thin fingers finding a hidden catch that released a small, rectangular panel of aged brickwork. With a slight, effortless shift of his shoulders, the boy vanished into a hidden crawlspace behind the main pneumatic lines, a space so confined and secret that it seemed to exist entirely outside the known architecture of the building. We followed him with the utmost caution, our movements slow, measured, and silent, until we found ourselves peering into a tiny, subterranean sanctuary, a private workshop carved into the very heart of the foundation, where the air was still and the world of the city felt like a distant, fading dream. The workshop was a masterpiece of minimalist utility, a space where every object had a place, and every shadow served a clear purpose. A single kerosene lamp sat upon a low wooden crate, its flame turned down to a steady, golden bead that cast a warm, flickering glow across the soot-stained bricks. Beside the lamp lay Albie's tools, arranged with the mathematical precision of a surgeon's instruments. There was a small, handheld mirror, a pair of long-nosed watchmaker's tweezers, and a velvet cloth stained with the finest, most transparent lubricating oil. The walls were lined with copper coils and brass fittings, creating an atmosphere of deep metallic intimacy. It was a place of profound, focused craft, a sanctuary where the chaos of the outside world was distilled into the quiet, rhythmic manipulation of physical matter. I felt a wave of deep relaxation wash over me as I stood there, my mind surrendering to the absolute stillness of this hidden pocket of human existence. As we watched in the amber gloom, the boy began the nightly ritual of his work, a performance of skill that was both hypnotic and terrifying in its absolute simplicity. He leaned toward a section of the brass pneumatic tube that had been surgically altered, a clever bypass valve that allowed him to control the flow of the pressurized air with a single, delicate movement of a lever. He waited in the silence, his head tilted, listening with his whole body to the rhythmic pulse of the building. Shh. The sound of an approaching canister grew louder, a muffled, ghostly whistle of pressurized intent traveling through the dark. Just as it reached his hidden junction, Albie's hand moved with a blur of practiced motion. He diverted the vacuum, the canister coming to a silent, cushioned halt within a padded chamber of his own design. It was a feat of mechanical interception that required the perfect timing of a master musician and the steady nerves of a ghost. The reveal of his method was a study in tactile perfection and industrial grace. He unscrewed the leather cap of the canister with a movement so fluid and natural, it seemed as though the metal itself was yielding to his will. Inside lay the slips of paper, the editorial proofs, destined for the compositor's waiting hand. With his silver tweezers, Albie extracted the thin, translucent sheets, laying them carefully upon his dark velvet cloth. He didn't rewrite them. He didn't even use a pen or a drop of fresh ink. Instead, he used his mirror and a small set of specialized metal stamps to flip the logical structure of the sentences. He worked with the soul of the language, reversing the polarity of the arguments by changing nothing but the relationship between the words. It was a surgical inversion of truth, performed in the steady golden light of a hidden lamp before he rolled the slips back into the cylinder and resealed the leather cap with a satisfying, rhythmic, and airtight click. The canister was returned to the main line, and with a soft, disappearing hiss, it vanished once more into the brass labyrinth, continuing its journey toward the presses as if nothing had ever happened. But the message it carried was now the quiet opposite of what it had been only seconds before. The process was repeated with the next canister, and the next, a rhythmic loop of correction that transformed the newspaper into a perfect mirror of Albie's own internal logic. I found myself drifting into a state of deep, meditative fascination, my focus entirely consumed by the beautiful minutiae of his movements. There was no malice in his face, only a vast, preoccupied, and scholarly peace. He was a boy who lived in the gaps of the world, fixing the errors of his betters with the silent, unwavering devotion of a saint. The lull in the action was filled with the exquisite, textured sounds of his solitary labor. Tink, tink, the soft, musical chime of the tweezers against a glass lens. The rhythmic, dry rasp of the leather seals being tightened. The gentle, rhythmic breathing of the boy as he focused on the microscopic alignment of the lead type. These sounds were a symphony of industry in miniature, a tactile exam of the Victorian underground that seemed to vibrate in the very center of my mind. The heavy, thrumming roar of the great presses above was a million miles away, a forgotten storm on the horizon. Here, in the crawl space, the universe was reduced to the scale of a brass fitting and the weight of a single sheet of paper. I felt my eyelids grow heavy, my own breath settling into a steady, unhurried pace that matched the flickering of the kerosene lamp upon the crate. Albie reached for a small, clear vial of oil, the liquid shimmering like liquid gold in the amber light. He applied a single, perfect drop to the hinge of the bypass valve, the oil spreading in a slow, perfect circle across the cold metal. The scent of it, sharp, clean, and industrial, filled the small space, a grounding aroma that spoke of maintenance, care, and the love of a machine. Every action he took was a testament to the beauty of the work, a reminder that even in the darkest, most soot-stained corners of the city, there is a place for precision and grace. We were witnesses to a secret history, a story of a boy who spoke to the machine in the language of air and was heard. The stillness of the chamber was absolute, a safe harbor in the rushing tide of the London night. Holmes remained perfectly motionless beside me, his eyes reflecting the steady golden bead of the lamp. He was not just observing a crime. He was appreciating a masterpiece of intellectual compulsion, a logic so pure it required no audience. He understood the boy's need for symmetry, the way a brilliant mind can become a prisoner of its own desire for order. The crawl space was not a hiding place of a criminal. It was a cathedral of logic, and Albie was its only priest, serving a god of perfect sentences. I watched the way the boy's shadow danced upon the bricks, a long, elegant shape that seemed to reach out and embrace the cold machinery with a father's warmth. The rhythm of the work continued, a steady, unwavering loop of interception and release that held the world in a state of suspended animation. The transition to the final act of our vigil was marked by a subtle, almost invisible shift in Holmes's posture. He didn't move toward the boy, nor did he speak a single word into the silence. Instead, I felt his hand settle upon my shoulder, a firm, grounding weight that carried a clear and silent command. We were to wait. We were to remain in the deep shadows, honoring the silence of the workshop until the cycle was finally complete and the logic had been served. The bridge to our confrontation was built of this shared, quiet patience, a lingering moment of observation where the observer and the observed were bound together by the rhythmic hiss of the air and the golden light of the lamp. As we stood there, tucked behind the iron pipes and the soot-stained masonry of the foundation, the world above continued its frantic, noisy, and chaotic descent toward the morning. But here, in the hidden junction of the pneumatic labyrinth, time had no meaning and no power. There was only the tink-tink of the metal tools, the clean smell of the oil, and the steady rhythmic heartbeat of a boy who had found the one place in London where the truth was exactly what he made of it. We waited in the velvet dark, our minds settled into a state of profound, peaceful focus, ready for the inevitable moment when the lamp would be extinguished and the secrets of the inverted intern would finally be brought to the light of day. The boy paused, his work for the night nearly done. He ran his hand over the brass pipe, a gesture of affection that was as soft as a whisper. The building around us seemed to acknowledge his touch, the vibrations of the presses settling into a deeper, more resonant hum. I felt a sense of completion, a feeling that the story had reached its natural midpoint of rest. The air in the crawlspace was cool and still, a final sanctuary of logic and silence before the world of men and consequences returned. We remained there, two shadows among many, breathing in time with the machine, waiting for the first gray light of dawn to filter through the cracks in the world. The loop of the night was closing, and with it, the secret of the silver vein. The golden bead of the kerosene lamp flickered softly in the heavy silence, casting long, dancing shadows of copper and ancient iron against the soot-stained bricks of the hidden chamber. In this absolute, focused stillness, Sherlock Holmes finally stepped from the deep, velvet darkness into the warm circle of light. His movement was not sudden, nor was it aggressive in its intent. It was the slow, deliberate unfolding of a shadow, a silent and graceful transition from observer to participant in this secret history. I followed him, my boots making only the faintest, rhythmic rustle against the damp dust of the stone floor, a sound that felt like a whisper in a cathedral. Albie Miller did not startle at our presence. He did not drop his silver tweezers, nor did he cast a single glance of fear toward the dark opening of his sanctuary. Instead, he simply continued his work, his ink-stained fingers moving with the same unhurried hypnotic precision as they had for hours. He was finishing his final correction of the night, a masterpiece of grammatical symmetry that would soon be traveling through the silver veins of the building toward the morning light. We stood there in a state of suspended animation, a quiet pocket of time outside the rushing world, watching as the boy rolled the thin, translucent slip of paper back into its leather-bound canister. There was a profound and lonely dignity in his focus, a sense of completion that transcended the common human understanding of crime and punishment. When the canister was finally returned to the main pneumatic line and the bypass valve was sealed with a soft, final click of metal on metal, Albie slowly turned his head. His eyes, large and luminous in the amber light of the lamp, held no malice and no regret, only a vast, preoccupied clarity. He looked at Holmes not as a captor or a representative of the law, but as another mind capable of perceiving the invisible, beautiful patterns of the world. The confrontation was not one of morality, but of pure logic, a quiet meeting of two solitary spirits who inhabited the high, cold, and silent places of the intellect. Holmes's voice, when he finally spoke, was a low and melodic murmur that seemed to vibrate in perfect harmony with the distant, rhythmic thrum of the building. He did not ask about accomplices or political motives, for those were the concerns of lesser men. He simply looked at the tray of specialized stamps and the delicate watchmaker's tools and said, in a tone that was almost a whisper, that the logic was flawed, was it not? Albie nodded once, a slow and solemn movement of his head that carried the weight of a shared secret. The boy began to speak, his voice a soft, rhythmic rasp that had the tactile quality of dry parchment rubbing against silk. He spoke not of money, power, or fame, but of the unbearable physical weight of an illogical sentence in a world of chaos. To Albie, a poorly constructed argument was a physical deformity, a jagged edge in a universe that should be smooth, continuous, and perfectly balanced. He did not wish to change the world's heart. He simply desired to fix the grammar of its mind. The reveal was a study in profound empathy and intellectual grace. Albie Miller was not a revolutionary seeking to topple governments. He was a genius whose mind was a permanent prisoner of its own desire for perfection. He described how the editor's words, so full of pomp and hollow patriotic fervor, had felt like grit in his eyes, a discord that he could not ignore. He couldn't help himself. Every night, as he moved through the unnoticed margins of the building's life, the errors would call out to him from the dark interior of the pneumatic tubes. He felt a desperate, holy necessity to intercept the slips, to flip the logic until the sentences were as balanced and beautiful as a mathematical equation. It was a solitary mission to ensure that the printed word was as perfect as the mind that conceived it. As I listened to his soft, rhythmic explanation, the last of my indignation vanished, replaced by a deep, drowsy sense of understanding. We were not looking at a villain, but at a vexing virtue operating in the dark. The tone of the hidden chamber shifted as they spoke, the amber light of the kerosene lamp feeling warmer, more protective, and more forgiving. Holmes's face, usually a mask of detached calculation and sharp edges, softened into an expression of profound, silent compassion. He reached out and picked up one of the silver tweezers, turning it over in the light with a rhythmic, appreciative movement of his fingers. He understood the boy's burden, for he too lived in a world where the lack of order was a constant, underlying discord that demanded resolution. There was no anger in Holmes, only a soft, resonant melody of comprehension that filled the small space between them. He spoke to Albie about the beauty of the craft, acknowledging the surgical precision of the inversions, as one master might speak to another. It was a conversation held in the language of the quiet hours, a shared recognition of the lonely heights where pure logic lives. I found myself leaning against the cold masonry of the wall, the rhythmic hiss and thump of the distant canisters acting as a soothing, repetitive background to their dialogue. The tension that had carried us through the fog of the morning and the deep shadows of the night was dissolving into the air, replaced by a sense of justice that was quiet, internal, and restorative. There would be no handcuffs tonight, no dramatic walk to the police station through the cold streets. The crime was merely a symptom of a mind too bright and too orderly for the messy world it inhabited. I watched the way the shadows of the pipes created a protective, intricate web around us, sealing us in this final, peaceful sanctuary of the night. The stillness of the foundation felt like a heavy, comfortable blanket, pulling my thoughts away from the complexities of the city and toward the simple, unwavering reality of my own breath. Albie began to extinguish his tools with a series of soft, rhythmic clicks, placing the tweezers in the mirror back into their velvet-lined case. Each sound was a period at the end of a long, intricate sentence, a signal that the night's work was done. He looked at Holmes with a faint, weary smile, a sign that the heavy burden of his logic had been shared and understood, if only for a brief moment in time. The lamp was turned down even further, the golden bead of light shrinking until the room was bathed in a deep, bruised purple twilight that invited the mind to rest. We were standing at the very edge of the resolution, the open loops of the mystery finally closing with a sense of profound, quiet harmony. The logic had been confronted, the ghost had been seen, and the world remained, for one more night, in a state of perfect grammatical balance. The transition from the hidden chamber to the world above was a slow, effortless ascent through the layers of the building. We left Albie there in his sanctuary, Holmes having already formed a plan in his mind that would protect the boy's brilliance while redirecting it toward a more constructive and peaceful end. We moved back through the narrow passages, our footsteps a rhythmic and gentle echo against the old stones. The air was growing fresher with every step, carrying the first, faint scent of the coming dawn and the cooling earth. We emerged from the bowels of Printing House Square and stepped back into the open courtyard, where the fog had settled into a thick silver carpet that muffled the world. The city was still deep in its slumber, a vast, silent organism dreaming of the news that would soon be delivered to every doorstep. The bridge to our final rest was found in the waiting hansom cab at the edge of the square, a dark silhouette against the gray mist. We walked toward it, our heels clicking softly on the wet cobbles in a steady, unhurried cadence that felt like a countdown to sleep. The cold air of the morning was not a shock, but a refreshing and grounding presence that cleared the last of the basement soot from our senses. Holmes signaled the driver with a brief silent gesture of his hand, and we climbed into the velvet-lined interior of the cab. The transition was complete from the hard stone and cold brass of the industrial machinery to the soft, swaying comfort of the carriage. The leather seats smelled of old tobacco and horsehair, a familiar and safe aroma that promised the final end of our journey. As the hansom began to move, its rhythmic clip-clop on the cobblestones creating a steady, soothing lullaby, I leaned back into the deep shadows and closed my eyes. The city outside blurred into a series of muffled sounds and gentle, rocking vibrations. Holmes sat beside me, his long, thin frame relaxed for the first time in many days. We were returning to the warmth of our hearth at Baker Street, carrying with us the secret of the Inverted Intern. The logic was safe, the truth was balanced, and the world was finally quiet. The journey was over, and as the cab swayed through the silver mist of the morning, I drifted into a deep, peaceful sleep, lulled by the steady heartbeat of the city and the absolute, unyielding perfection of a story that had finally found its proper end. The night was done, the mystery was solved, and the logic was at rest. The wheels turned, the fog embraced us, and the silence was total. The heavy oak door of our sanctuary at 221B Baker Street closed behind us with a soft, solid thud, sealing away the cold, damp breath of the London morning. The transition from the industrial roar of Printing House Square to the familiar, amber-lit stillness of our drawing room was a profound embrace of comfort. The fire in the hearth had burned low during our long absence, reduced now to a deep, pulsing bed of glowing embers that radiated a steady, ancient warmth. I watched the way the crimson light danced upon the backs of our leather armchairs, creating long, flickering shadows that seemed to reach out and welcome us home. There was no urgency now, no pressing need for logic or action. The world of the machine was far away, and here, in the quiet heart of our home, the only rhythm that remained was the slow, steady heartbeat of the house itself. Holmes did not immediately turn to his chemical apparatus or his files. Instead, he moved with a slow, fluid grace toward the corner where his Stradivarius rested in its velvet-lined case. His movements were rhythmic and unhurried, a study in quietude. He took the instrument in his thin, steady hands, the polished wood catching the fading light of the fire like a piece of dark amber. Without a word, he began to play a slow, mournful air that seemed to rise from the very shadows of the room. It was a melody without a name, a series of long, searching notes that drifted through the air like thin ribbons of silk. The music did not demand attention. It simply existed, a soft and haunting presence that filled the spaces between our thoughts, pulling the mind down into a state of deep, effortless relaxation. As I settled into my chair, the weight of the investigation began to lift from my shoulders, replaced by a sense of profound moral resolution. Sir Jasper Phipps had been informed of the truth, his reputation spared, and his newspaper restored to its rightful order. But the true satisfaction lay in the fate of Albie Miller. The boy was no longer a ghost haunting the margins of the press. Through Holmes's quiet intervention, he had been placed in a school for logic in the countryside, a place of stone and silence, where his extraordinary mind could find its own symmetry without the need for subversion. All was right in the world. The paradox of the inverted intern had been resolved not with a gavel, but with a hand of guidance. I felt a wave of peace wash over me, a certainty that the scales of justice and mercy had found their perfect balance in the dark. The music continued, a steady and unwavering loop of sound that seemed to mirror the slow curling of the smoke from Holmes's pipe. I watched as the blue-gray vapor rose from the bowl, drifting upward in long, elegant spirals that vanished into the shadows of the ceiling. The smoke moved with a purposeless grace, a visual representation of a mind at rest. It shifted and turned, caught in the invisible currents of the room, creating a landscape of ethereal shapes that invited the mind to wander and then to settle. Each puff of smoke was a moment of release, a fragment of the day's anxiety being carried away and dissolved into the stillness. The scent of the tobacco, rich, earthy, and familiar, acted as a grounding anchor, a sensory reminder that we were safe, we were warm, and the work was finally done. The lull of the afternoon was absolute. The fire in the hearth gave a soft, rhythmic crackle, a tiny explosion of sparks that lived and died in a fraction of a second. I watched the way the embers shifted, the glowing orange core of the fire slowly being covered by a delicate silver-gray lace of ash. It was a slow and beautiful decay, a reminder of the natural cycle of energy and rest. The shadows in the room grew longer and more profound, the amber light of the fire fading into a deep, bruised purple as the day outside truly surrendered to the twilight. The boundaries of the room felt soft and indistinct, the walls melting away into the general atmosphere of the evening. I felt my body grow heavy, sinking deeper into the soft cushions of my chair, surrendered to the rhythmic pulse of the fire and the violin. Holmes's silhouette was a dark and peaceful shape against the window, his bow moving with a slow, hypnotic regularity. The notes of the violin were growing softer now, blending with the distant, muffled sounds of the city. The roar of London was no longer a cacophony. It was a low, rolling vibration, a sound like the sea heard from a great distance. The clip-clop of a passing cab, the distant cry of a street vendor, the rumble of an omnibus, all were softened and filtered through the thick fog and the heavy glass of our windows until they became a single, soothing white noise. The world was withdrawing, its frantic energy replaced by the infinite silence of the falling night. We were drifting on a tide of quietude, a slow current that was carrying us toward the shores of sleep. I closed my eyes, but the images of the night remained: the brass pipes, the silver veins, the golden light of the hidden lamp. They were no longer puzzles to be solved, but memories to be observed, as fleeting and harmless as the smoke from the pipe. The rhythm of the violin was the only thing that mattered now, a steady thread of sound that guided the mind through the labyrinth of the day and out into the open spaces of the evening. My breathing settled into a deep and regular pattern, matching the slow exhalation of the fire. The room was a sanctuary of logic and peace, a place where the truth was known and the mind could finally let go of its vigil. The incident of the inverted intern was over, leaving behind only the quiet satisfaction of a balanced equation. The music faded into a single long-held note that seemed to hang in the air forever, a silver line of sound that slowly dissolved into the silence. Holmes laid his violin aside with a movement so quiet it made no sound at all. The room was still, save for the soft dying pulse of the embers. The city was a ghost, the building was a dream, and we were the only reality that remained. We were at rest, the logic of the night having found its conclusion in the warmth of the hearth and the beauty of the song. The darkness was a welcome companion, a soft and velvet curtain that was finally closing upon the day. The case of the inverted intern was more than a mere disturbance in print. It was a final reflection on the profound and delicate beauty of order in a world of shifting shadows. As I sat in the gathering dark of our drawing room, the events of the day felt like the chapters of a book that had finally been closed and placed upon a high, quiet shelf. The image of Albie Miller, the boy who sought symmetry in the dark, remained as a gentle reminder that the most profound truths are often found not in the grand confession or the loud proclamation, but in the quiet, meticulous mind operating by its own unshakable rules. There was a sanctuary in that thought, a realization that beneath the chaos of the city and the noise of the press, there is a steady, underlying logic that holds the universe together, a silent rhythm that ensures the sun will rise and the ink will dry. The mantra of our lives at Baker Street seemed to echo in the stillness of the room. The most profound truths are found in the quiet mind. I repeated the words to myself, a slow and rhythmic internal chant that aligned with the steady pulse of my own heartbeat. The quiet mind, the quiet mind. It was a state of being where the clutter of the day was stripped away, leaving only the essential, peaceful core of existence. I felt my thoughts slowing, the gears of my own intellect coming to a gentle, cushioned halt. The problems of the government, the scandal of the newspaper, and the mysteries of the street were no longer my concern. They belonged to the world of the waking, and I was moving steadily, effortlessly, toward the world of the sleeping. In this twilight state, between the memory of the day and the promise of the night, a new thought drifted into my mind, like a fragment of a dream. I heard Holmes's voice, or perhaps it was only the memory of his voice, mentioning a new trifle that had come to his attention, something about a blue carbuncle found in the crop of a Christmas goose. The words were soft and indistinct, a hint of a future mystery that carried no urgency and no weight. It was a story for another day, a puzzle for another time. For now, it was merely a beautiful, shimmering image at the edge of my consciousness, a blue spark in the velvet dark that added to the sense of wonder and peace. The mystery of the blue carbuncle was a distant star, and I was content to let it shine without seeking to reach it. I felt my eyelids growing heavy, a weight as natural and irresistible as the falling of the snow. They were like the thick, velvet curtains of a great theater, slowly descending to mark the end of the performance. My gaze lingered for a moment on the hearth, where the last of the fire had finally gone out, leaving only a bed of cool, gray ash. The warmth remained in the air, a soft and lingering presence, but the light was gone. The room was now a space of shadows and silence, a perfect void, where the mind could finally surrender its last remaining threads of awareness. The silence was not empty, it was infinite, a vast and welcoming ocean that was ready to swallow the day. The transition to absolute sleep was a movement into the great rhythmic heartbeat of the night. I could no longer hear the city at all. The London fog had muffled the world into non-existence, leaving only the sanctuary of 221B. I was drifting, my thoughts becoming fluid and purposeless, like the smoke from a pipe that has long since gone out. The logic of the inverted intern was complete. The symmetry was restored, and my mind was a mirror of that perfect, quiet order. There was nothing left to do, nothing left to see, and nothing left to think. The silence was total, a deep and velvet darkness that was as comforting as a mother's embrace. As the last embers of my consciousness faded, the air seemed to fill with the soft rhythmic sound of rain against the window pane, a gentle, persistent tapping that was the only music that remained. It was a sound that had no beginning and no end, a loop of nature that promised us sleep without interruption. Somewhere in the distance, a phantom violin seemed to play one final fading note, a sound so thin and beautiful it was indistinguishable from the rain. I surrendered to the dark, my breath long and regular, my mind finally perfectly still. The incident was over. The silence was infinite. Good night, Watson. Good night, London. Good night.